So we move into section 3. We've looked at the pre-scene through our 6 videos. We've got a good feel for the company now. Let's consolidate on that by applying these tools and techniques. In fact, this first area concerns us with the definition of a strategic analysis. Pretty simple. We've talked about it before. We're looking to apply a set of techniques to analyze this particular company. What we'll find out is areas such as strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, the competitive forces in the marketplace, the whole area of strategy formulation as per this first video, and other areas that are important and often examined, Ansof's matrix, ethics, etc. We'll conclude with a feel for strategic options going forward. So that's our strategic analysis. What are we going to cover in this first video? Well, I've broken it down into 3 main parts, and indeed each of the parts of the strategic analysis has around about 3 to 4 elements. We're going to start with the area of strategy formulation. You'll be familiar with Johnson, Scholes and Whittington, and indeed the ACCA model, and indeed the toss-up, in other words the consideration for businesses, whether or not they're EM or not, as to whether or not they engage in long-term strategic planning. Certainly they have other choices. I'm covering 2 main areas under this banner. You'll see a basic rational model, and outside of that, Mintzberg's emergent approach. There are other approaches, but we're just trying to get a feel for, well, which of these would most suit this particular business, this partnership. Outside of that, we know about the SWOT, and note that in terms of the use of the SWOT, you may or may not disagree or agree with some of my points. You may add more in. Bottom line is, in my experience, very often the SWOT is a source of questions, or it's linked to question requirements. The SWOT's an important model for us. Mendeley we're familiar with, a priority tool, a prioritization tool for the myriad of stakeholders based on power and interest. Let's kick off. Let's look at strategy formulation. Now I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it depending on what device you're actually watching this video on. That's a little bit too small, my apologies. Let's move it across. Now, you'll recall what I said about strategy. Yeah. Now, we know that this area of strategy is an important element. After all, strategic business leader exam. We're asking the question here with these 2 models, and only these 2. We're simplifying things. What approach do the partners and indeed the management team use to formulating strategy? This is certainly the classic, the traditional ACCA, analysis, choice, implementation, linked in obviously to J, S and W. So let me walk you through it just as a reminder. In terms of the rational or formal approach, really it starts right at the beginning with mission and objectives. In other words, the user outlining, well, what's our purpose? What's our raison d'etre? Why are we here? And then building from there through to objectives, goals, etc. And note, as I've said elsewhere, let's be familiar with the whole drill down in that hierarchy towards KPIs and indeed CSFs. So let's establish our mission. Where do we go from there? Well, this process involves a sort of appraisal of our position, both from an internal perspective and indeed external. And note obviously that many of the models included within this particular strategic analysis are relevant to an external environment appraisal. So this position analysis really assesses where the company is in terms of its resources, capabilities from an internal perspective, and indeed what's going on in the environment? Let's apply, let's say, the five forces. Let's look at ANSOF, let's look at pest, etc., etc. So, leading from, I guess, your A for analysis, what we should be able to do, and what this particular partner should be able to do, if it takes this approach to strategy formulation, is to come up with a set of options. Now, note that the rational formal model is certainly long winded. It involves a lot of work. It involves the application of techniques not just externally, but also internally. A resource audit, as an example. So, the bottom line is after the appraisal is done, this could take 3, 6, 9 months. We're looking to come up with a possible set of options for the business 2, 3, 4, and indeed we're looking to evaluate those options and to choose one, maybe two. Remember that for most businesses, resources are limited. If we have a set of 4 or 5 options, we're unlikely to be able to do them all. We need to employ a technique. Here we go. What technique? More often than not, the SAF. SAF. Suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. And if I had a pound, a euro, or a dollar for every time I marked a mock exam where SAF is part of the requirement and it's been badly answered, I'd be buying everybody who's listening to this particular video nice Christmas presents. The SAF model is very straightforward, and yet it's not focused on by students in their preparation. What are we thinking about? Well, suitability. Well, we're talking about fit, strategic fit. What is the strategic direction of this business? What is the strategic purpose of this business? What have they been doing? Are they going to continue that? Does this particular strategic option, let's say option 1, does it fit with this business or not? That's the suitable area in a very brief nutshell. Outside of that, acceptability. We're talking about acceptability to key stakeholders, certainly shareholders, but also others. We're also talking about risk. If the risk is too much for us, let's say that these two partners, and we're not told, are extremely risk averse. Maybe they are, given their requirement for control and independence. But if option 2 is extremely risky, does it tie in with them? So that profile, certainly from the perspective of the partners who are in effect the next area for us, let's note, is feasibility. And broadly speaking, that means can we do it? We've got the capability. Have we got the resources? We've got the cash. We've got the manpower. Have we got the tech know-how to be able to put this option into play? So that SAF technique is key. Once we've chosen maybe 1, maybe 2, we implement. From implementation, we move to review and control, and then down in a loop. So really, the proponents of this particular approach to formulation would suggest it's bulletproof, it's comprehensive, it's wide-ranging. You really get a good feel for what you're good at, your capabilities, resources, but also what's going on in the market. Now, the flip side, obviously, is it's time-consuming, it's costly. This takes a lot of work. Have we got the expertise, the skills to be able to use these techniques? Have we got the time? The other problem is environments. More and more so now, business environments, economic environments, markets change rapidly. And this technique will take time. By the time it's in play, let's say option 1 and 3, it may well be that the markets change. So let's think about the pluses and minuses associated with this slightly long-winded, traditional, I won't say old approach to formulation. And indeed, let's compare it to Mintzberg's emergent approach. Much simpler. Now, does Mintzberg's approach mean no planning at all? Not really. What it means is, broadly speaking, let's begin with plans and patterns. We have patterns of behavior. This particular partnership in the EM industry in Holland has patterns. It showed patterns. For example, a focus on private and corporate with the emphasis on corporate, a big focus on IT and IS, a focus on control, quality, independence, etc., etc. So let's recognize that and move forward on the basis that those plans and patterns are really our intended strategy. But what Mintzberg says is what tends to happen is some of those plans and patterns don't come into play for different reasons. The environment, staffing, cash, etc. And indeed, we split up and move towards a deliberate strategy, which is part of our original plans and patterns, but also things emerge over time, opportunities, things that we didn't think of at the outset. Clearly, markets, broadly speaking, are dynamic. So at the end of the day, our realized strategy is a combo of areas that emerge over time because we keep our eyes open and suck and see, and indeed our original plans and patterns are deliberate strategy. So you can see that this is quick, it's not as time consuming. It also allows the user to take advantage of opportunities as they come about. Certainly the rational formal approach much more rigid. So really the advantages of the emergent approach would probably be the flip-sided disadvantages indeed of the rational approach and vice versa. So what do we think in relation to our case? What do we think in relation to this partnership? We're guessing, but it seems to me with this small, successful, tight-knit young company, I would have thought that the emergent approach is more agreeable for the reasons that I've outlined. Let's move on. Our next area is the SWOT, and as mentioned, this is often the source of questions, or it's definitely linked into question requirements. I won't read it to you, but those are my key four. Now, in terms of the big strengths, certainly this tendering area is important. They're excellent at tendering. Outside of that, clearly they've got a strong brand and reputation. Look at the revenues. The ITIS areas we've said is key for them. They must protect it. I've said question mark on the financials. Let's bear in mind 6 years is a short timescale. The revenues are big, but they're still a small company relative to the overall market within Holland and indeed the global market. The question mark pertains to the issues with the falling margins. Something's going on. It may well be pricing. So those are the key strengths. Let's move into the weaknesses. And again, with each of the four areas, I've just chosen four. I could choose even a number of others, but I want to keep it punchy. Now, first key point, obviously, is their home. Small relative to other players. Remember, four big boys, four market leaders, and a lot of small players. That's a weakness for this business. So, relatively speaking, being home based, not having access to international markets, is certainly a problem. Outside of that, people often say your strength can be your weakness. This reliance on just two people. If we lose one, if one gets poached or moves on or passes away, that's a major problem for this business. They're not very well spread. There's two key people. Something happens to one of them, this business could end. In terms of opportunities, as I've said, bear with me 1 second. In terms of opportunities, quite a few, and for me, it's very likely that the examiner focuses in on some of these areas. He must do. They'll be looking to expand, they'll be looking at strategic options. Clearly, market development is an option. Either nationally, in other words, further penetration, but certainly internationally. Now, there are risks associated with that. What are they? Let's think about the risks of, let's say, this partnership launching in to a neighboring country. Other opportunities are new services. The virtual area has been mentioned, it's very small at the moment. Other events, and certainly the area of government, who, as we saw, have recently opted for the launch through EMs of some virtual events. Acquisitions must be an option. They need to find ways to keep growing turnover, and acquiring a small player must be one. What are the strategic benefits and risks of that? In terms of tech, we know disruptive tech is a key point within this particular syllabus for SBL. So, as I've said before, two things we're going to do. We're going to get savvy with the key points within the syllabus, but we're also going to go online. We're going to look at what real life EMs are doing on the tech side, on the disruptive tech side. Remember my caution. My caution is we don't need to be experts, and also we're going to go online and do a little bit of research. After all, this is a role play stroke real life exam, but we're not going to go crazy. Not every night, several hours. Now I'm an expert on the EM industry. Okay? In terms of the threats, I'll just move the page down. It's a little bit easier. Clearly, number one is the takeover. They're small. This is a competitive marketplace. Players keep entering it. Barriers are low. Outside of that, something that's maybe nearly as important, key staff. If there are small players, and indeed large international players, clearly poaching and the whole area of retention of key staff is a problem. I'm talking about the managers, possibly the partners, or other key staff. The competition is a threat for numerous reasons, to a lesser extent, regulation, because as I signposted elsewhere, regulation, new legislation would probably be known reasonably in advance. So that concludes this particular area: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. You may or may not disagree. As long as you've considered it, that's okay. Remember, with case study exams, there's no one answer. You know, we'll see a model answer produced by the ACCA, we'll see an answer produced by a prize winning student, but there's hundreds of correct answers. So give your opinion, justify it. Let's practice. Next area for us is Mendello, and as mentioned, for Mendello, we know this has to be the easiest set of marks on the paper. Requirements will mention stakeholders. Let's put in, this stakeholder XYZ under the Mendello's matrix banner would probably be high power, low interest, therefore keep satisfied, government, regulators, etc., etc. For me, the first area is simple enough: minimal effort, low power, low interest. Lower level employees, there will be some. Next area, a little bit more interesting. You may or may not agree with my analysis. Certainly lower and middle management for me would have low power, but certainly high interest. They're dependent upon this business for their salary. Outside of that, suppliers, there will be a range of suppliers to this particular business. I picked out IT and IS just as an example. Again, there will be a number of suppliers in this area of IT and IS within the Harland industry within the country. For me, they're certainly highly interested, but they have very little power to do anything. The other area is that maybe the smaller players within this particular industry, we're told that outside of the with a number of key small players. So really, those key small players, for me, have fairly low power, but they're certainly interested in what a company like this or a partnership like this are doing. That's for sure. Moving from there, keep satisfied. This is an area that sometimes students go a little bit wrong on. You know, they often tend to put regulators, government, etc., into key players. They're not. You know, it's high power, low interest because governments are busy, regulators are busy. Certainly the IEO is busy. They're only interested when you overstep the mark. So for me, definitely keep satisfied. General public will be interested in events. You only have to look at the press to see that. Outside of that, the possibility of TUs or indeed other associations. Last and indeed biggest area, certainly the management team and the founders, high interest and high power. Absolutely customers. We're talking specifically of private and obviously the big one, the corporates. The main competitors for me have high power and high interest too, for the reasons that those four probably act in a predatory way. Maybe that's part of the reason why they're up there. So that's the key players. You may, as I've said, or may not agree with my categorization. As mentioned, there's more than one categorization for a given stakeholder. It's not about where we put it, it's about how we justify it. So there are many, many answers to a case study script. Let's use Mendelow's matrix in our script. Easy marks, absolutely. So that concludes part one of the strategic analysis. I hope you've got a feel for how I work and indeed how I lay things out within these particular mind maps, and you're finding the mind maps okay. Obviously note that hard copies are there for you to add to, and I would certainly download, print those hard copies and use them, absolutely, and quote areas of this strategic analysis set of videos times 3 in your scripts wherever possible. We don't have to be asked about the SWOT to quote the SWOT. We don't have to be asked about Porter's 5 forces to quote the bargaining power of suppliers. Absolutely not. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for listening.